Really
Mhm.
spend majority of your time understanding the problem that you are looking to solve, and then look at the options of tools that are available to you, generative AI being one of them, and say, hey, how can this tool solve my problem in the most effective, cost efficient, secure, safe, and compelling way?
Welcome to the Talking AI podcast, where we talk AI with both experts in the field and early adopters. I'm your host, Matt Page, and we're here to demystify AI for you so you can get some value from it. Let's talk some AI. Gen AI promises to completely transform our world, how we work, how we live, everything, it seems like nowadays. But the question is, do the core first principles also change, especially in the realm of like product management and strategy? And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today with Uday Kumar, a product strategy and management leader with experience at Capital One, PwC, Volkswagen, to name a few. And Uday focuses on data decisioning and AI, really striving to bridge that gap between complex technology and practical user centric solutions. But welcome to the show, Uday.
Thank you, Matt. Happy to be here.
Yeah, excited to chat about this. I love the strategy side of things. I love the product side of things. And to the initial point we just hit on, I think that's a big question. With Gen AI coming in, it's new, it's novel, it promises this amazing future. But like, what's your take in terms of from a product mindset approach, strategy? Do things start to change there as well? What's the same? What changes, if
Yeah.
anything?
Yeah. The questions you just posed are really fundamental questions. And when I think as a product practitioner, as a product person, the fundamentals never change. End of day, when we think of why are we in the business of products, is really to
Mhm.
solve problems, to understand customer needs, whether they are explicit or whether they are latent, to help solve those needs in meaningful ways. And when we start talking about the solution part, the solutioning part, that is when we start looking at what are the tools and technologies that are available to us. And in that sense, generative AI, which is a subset of the larger AI sort of category umbrella, is another tool set which has been made available to us, which has been offered to us over the past couple of years. Whether you are in the healthcare business or whether you are in the fintech business or the education business, we all need to understand that domain. We all need to be passionate about the domain. We need to understand what good and great looks like to the different customer segments in each of those domains that we're passionate about. And then we go about understanding what their needs are and go about meeting them. Traditionally, if you roll back, it was classical software development. We were building, and rather we were solving problems by first understanding the needs and then bringing your traditional tools. Back in my days, and I'm going to date myself a little bit, it was Visual Basic, Power Builder, those kind of things, right? Your client server technology, right? And then Oracle and ERP, SAP, and all that stuff came along. We started to use those more elaborate enterprise-wide sort of tools and technologies to go solve problems. Alongside the internet came, and then we had the explosion of cloud, and then AI came along, and that offered us even more slick and scalable and secure and reliable tools and technologies. And now we have generative AI, which is offering another really interesting way to solve those problems. So I think end of day, it's gonna be the fundamentals will still continue to be that we need to really, like they say, fall in love with the problem, right? Really
Mhm.
spend majority of your time understanding the problem that you are looking to solve, and then look at the options of tools that are available to you, generative AI being one of them, and say, hey, how can this tool solve my problem in the most effective, cost efficient, secure, safe, and compelling way?
Yeah, I love that. Fall in love with the problem. And with any hype cycle, you could call what we're in a hype cycle right now. People search for solutions and they forget about the problem a lot of times. I'm curious, how would you rate overall, like the world right now and our ability to solve for problems versus getting a little too excited and trying to search for problems on a scale of 1 to 10? What would you give it right now?
I think we're still maybe at a 5, maybe a 6 on a scale of
Yeah.
1 to 10, because I continue to see folks, both when I'm talking to prospect clients or customers, or even like I spend some time at college campuses talking to students who are looking to solve problems. And yes, across the spectrum, people do get caught up in the shiny object syndrome, which is like,
Mhm.
oh, that's cool. Let me go do that. I'll do it that way, as opposed to like when I or we start having them clarify the problem and why is that a problem and who is the customer and do they really need a solution, or are they just happy and content with what they have? That's when things start falling apart. I think, again, going back to this phrase about falling in love with the problem, it's another way to think about it is that the more diligent and disciplined we are in the earlier part of that product journey or discovery, if you will, the better it'll serve us in terms of what we're going to solve for and how we're going to solve for it. It's a bit like pay me now, pay me later. And
Mhm.
so you want to just do that upfront due diligence and really take your time, have those conversations. And then as you really start feeling good about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to really check all the boxes. This is the opposite of that, is like this analysis paralysis. I'm just in a constant state of analyzing, researching the market. That solutioning will keep getting punted. And guess what? The problem doesn't exist anymore, or somebody else has
Mhm.
gone solve the problem like you. So there's the time to market, the timing to market are equally important. So, if you bring all that together, there is a way to thread a needle and orchestrate those activities along your product journey so that you make sure that you're optimizing for understanding, assessing, timing, solutioning, and testing and launching.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of that here in a second. You mentioned like the product discovery side. I want to get into the piece where we're bringing it into the organization in a minute as well. But before we go there, I'm curious, do you have any kind of litmus test you use right now? I'm thinking when some solutions are pitched or provided with generative AI, I find myself like, okay, let me do it the more traditional way. And sometimes it takes longer. It's about the same with generative AI. And I think as you change is hard, especially with something new. Like it needs to be markedly better in a lot of ways for people to actually adopt it, which ChatGPT at the foundation level,
Yeah.
yes, it's doing that. But when you get into more point solutions and process enhancements and things like that, but any kind of like litmus test that you've seen past that one that's been
Yeah.
interesting?
I'm gonna take a stab at that, but I think a couple of different ways to think about it. One is that there's this growing concern amongst this academia, like everything from K-12 to college, right? Like how where students are using Chat GPT or generative AI to like blatantly write essays or do their homework or things like that.
Mhm.
And that's where I feel like, yes, generative AI can solve those problems. That I think we need to be very careful introducing those tools and techniques to that audience, which is still in
Mhm.
a foundational stage of their learning, if you will. So for students, and I have a couple of students, one in college, one in high school, I feel like it's important for them to really put pen to paper and really
Mhm.
push the mental faculties and do things the old way, the
Yeah.
hard way, right? So that you are getting understanding the different pieces and parts and pieces of how this puzzle comes together. Now, once you have satisfied and met those competencies, if you will, depending what grade you are in K-12 or in college, then yes, in order to accelerate and amplify your outcomes, certainly go and arm yourself with those tools. So I think that's one thing that we need to be careful about, and it's a way for me to really think about, hey, is generative AI something that will improve the outcomes of this audience, right? I think you need to think about that, and the audience comes in different shapes and sizes. Now, so on the flip side, if I start thinking about the baby boomers. I start thinking about I'm not sure if I'm a baby boomer yet or not, but anyway, but 50 plus, you start getting that audience. These are folks who have lived through a number of life experiences, and now they're at a point where their time is super stretched. And how do I have this audience maximize and get more out of their investments and time? So whether that's they're looking for travel itinerary suggestions, whether they're looking for something related to healthcare or something related to their financial retirement planning. And I think generative AI can be huge over there. And those are the kind of problems that really time for plucking and solving. So I think so that's a two bookends, if you will, on the spectrum of the audiences, and then there's everything in between. So I think everything starts with just my last point on this one is everything starts with understanding who's the audience, how mature are they, and what their needs, and then you solve, and then you see whether generative AI is worth considering to solve this, or should be done a different way.
Yeah, no, I love that. And just for the audience to unpack a bit, the one thing that I really keyed on is how is it impacting the outcome? Like the example you gave with the student, yes, they're acing their tests, they're getting all their homework done, but you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater and they haven't learned anything in the process. So it's negatively impacted the goal or the outcome they're trying to succeed with. I don't know if you saw some of the ChatGPT 4.0 demos, which that'll be old news by the time this airs because everything's changing daily. But the Khan Academy one, that was interesting because it was the AI like helping the student along. It was more of a kind of teaching mode versus just blatantly giving them the answers. I think that was a super kind of interesting area there. But if we look at bringing Gen AI into the organization, large or small, you work with a lot of clients that are trying to do this now. We do as well at HatchWorks. Where do you start? Let's frame it up. You're brought in by
Yeah.
CIO, chief product officer, and they're like, okay, Gen AI. And a lot of the times they just want to like get it in there. They want to sprinkle on the Gen AI. But where do you suggest organizations start to actually get real value out of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Excellent question. And I think that question is like prime and pertinent for any disruptive tech that's coming
Yeah.
along the way to a CIO, right? It's like, hey, how do I start? Where do I start? And I've been having some conversations with some leaders on the federal side, some on the commercial side, some even on startups. I think you need to understand the stakes that your organization, that your mission is all about, right? A lot of setups are really high stake setup, right? Federal agencies and those leaders, they are highly regulated sort of domains. The stakes are super high. You're there to serve the citizens. You have to be very careful what you're bringing, what you're offering, right? On the flip side, startups, a bit like Wild West, and they can do some experiments so they can go to market real fast and fail fast and get their hands burned, and maybe they're okay with that. And then there are use case in between. I think the key is first thing is assess your context and the space in which you operate, what your customers are, what your stakeholders are, what kind of regulatory and compliance related needs are applied to your context. And number two is then always take baby steps. We talked about this classic crawl before you walk, before you run. So start by crawling. And the crawling could mean, for example, a highly regulated setup. Let me start with that. Let's talk about agency housing and urban development, right? HUD is sitting on a lot of regulatory policies and and those kind of documents. It runs a lot of programs for a variety of the citizen population out there. And there's a lot of text content that's sitting within its enterprise. And a lot of the content is also public facing. If HUD wanted to take a small step and do a small experiment, say, hey, how do I demonstrate to my stakeholders that there's value in bringing generative AI into my context? I would look at, can we make it easy for my internal stakeholders, the HUD employees and partners and contractors, to be able to search through these policy documents, through these regulation documents? Because I would argue that there are hundreds and thousands of the documents and pages of that, right? We've been seeing, especially with Gemini coming out and now with 4.0, that the context window and the token size, that continues to blow up. I think we're talking about a million tokens and maybe trending 10 million. And so we could be feeding the typical model hundreds and thousands of pages of documentation. It doesn't have to be a single doc. We can stitch all these things together. There's ways to orchestrate that. But now imagine somebody at HUD, it could be a policy analyst, it could be a pricing analyst, whatever. They could literally have a conversation with these hundreds and thousands of pages of policy documents that have been collected and aggregated over like the 10, 15, 20 years, and ask it questions like, hey, what were the trends in Loudoun County in 2018 with regards to the housing benefits and funds that were giving to the I know some community, could be the Black and Latino community, could be any of them. So imagine you can have that conversation with these documents, which today, in the absence of generative AI, would be really tedious and laborious.
Yeah.
You have to really go to a subject matter expert who knows these documents intimately and then really rely on them and in a new block. But now, doing something like this, which is a fairly low stakes experiment, it does a few different things. One, this is not very difficult to set up, right? Because your documents right there on your Confluence pages in your S3 buckets. It's very easy to wrap it with a chat GPT like interface. Number two, when you build this, you can do a small pilot and just expose it to a small audience within the HUD enterprise. So just in case something was to go south, you're limiting the blast radius. It's within that small context. And then you can gradually ramp it up to the bigger audience. Number three is it also allows you to demonstrate value of and benefits and the outcomes that we were talking about earlier. Is this really compelling? Allows you to demonstrate all these things and more to your internal leaders who are maybe suspect about the benefits and merits, and because there's a lot of concern with regards to security and IP and data getting exposed to folks who are not authorized for that.
Yeah, you almost got to get some points on the board to get buy-in from others. But just to break it down, I love how you talked about it. And for listeners, I would almost visualize, and we use this a lot when we're doing a workshop, just take a simple matrix, right? Value, low to high, and then the ease of implementation, or you can look at it on a risk vector as well, and just start placing use cases there. And then you can find those that may be higher value, lower risk. It could be one way of looking at it, or how easy is it to implement, or how easy is it to access the data. But I love how you talked about it limiting the blast radius. So if this thing goes sideways and starts fighting with itself, what's going to be the potential impact. I saw recently Morgan Stanley, they did a similar kind of use case where they provided this to their financial advisors, right? So it took all the different reports and documents and things that they would use and spend, hours weeding through to provide insights to their clients, and they were using generative AI to easily access and query their own data. And if you think about it, it's their internal people using it. So you have that barrier between the end user. So if something does go weird, they're there. So that was another kind of interesting use case there as well.
I think the where this is prime when it comes to leveraging and doing some experimenting is where you have a lot of text
Yeah.
context content sitting. And that's what we call unstructured, right? It's words and paragraphs and essays and policy docs. But there's a way to also approach structured data, and we can talk about that as well. But yeah, it's really because that is the most tedious, right? As
Yeah.
humans, as much as I enjoyed reading when I was growing up, I'm very selective about reading. I enjoy conversations. I enjoy watching, and reading has become a bit tedious, right? And
Hmm.
there are fair amount and number of adults who still enjoy reading, including my wife. But I rather have a conversation and watch something. So for me, if somebody was to come to me and say, Uday, you don't have to read all these security documents or these policy documents. You could just query, and this is just like on your pace, when you need, what you need, and you get that information right away. That'd be super compelling. That would make my life so much easier. And then
Yeah.
also the outcome that I'm trying to drive would be so much more compelling.
And I think one of the beautiful things of generative AI too, that some may say it's undervalued or considered, is just the pattern matching ability
Yeah.
of generative AI. So it's not just that, okay, I have hundreds of documents and it can go find the right answer. It's matching patterns within the data set or what it's been trained on. And that really starts to become dynamic. It almost begins like it's mimicking logic in a sense, which you could argue that maybe that's what our whole just logic and brains, how we operate, is based on anyways, but it starts to provide a lot of exponential value in that way.
Yeah. One quick thing that just came to my mind as you were talking about logic and reasoning is remembering you coming from my Capital One days. One of the things that I worked with my teams and for my customers up there was building these decision engines for credit underwriting and fraud detection.
Yeah.
And most of credit underwriting and fraud detection back in the days had been rules based and still continues to be rules based. Imagine you've got a spreadsheet with rules written in, which is okay, FICO score is this, approve if not, decline, right? And so on and so forth. During my time, we started experimenting and brought to market AI models, both on the fraud side and as well the credit side. And then we started orchestrating your traditional decision engines, which were rules based, along with
Mhm.
AI models. So there was a whole set of elevated and enhanced benefits we started seeing when we started running these decision engines in two parts. One, as a transaction comes in, it's hitting the rules spreadsheet and getting a set of decisions over there, and then it goes through the model and gets a decisions or a score, and then we arbitrate to that and get a final decision. What's happening with your traditional credit and fraud models, which was based on training structured data? There was
Mm.
a lot of effort that was invested in labeling the data and feature engineering and so on and so forth, which required a lot of logic and reasoning. What generative AI is doing and is about to disrupt is that we don't, there might be cases, and I'm sure somebody's already solving this, is where you don't have to really go and curate your data sets or your
Yeah.
transaction history in that way, which was very expensive, right? Labeling data and feature engineering was very expensive. Now imagine I could just take transaction objects, right? That transaction object has the user's information, where they're purchasing, what they're buying, and also maybe their transaction history, and let a generative AI, a fine-tuned generative model, loose on that. I'm pretty sure I can solve that fraud problem or credit problem fairly
Mhm.
reasonably. It may not be as precise and on point as an ML model, but I believe that with an NLP model, which are traditionally LLM models, I can get very close to that. So I think that's where it's going to start lowering the barriers in terms of these use cases that were in the past considered very sophisticated and
Yeah.
had to be done by data scientists and that really specialized staff. I think that barrier is going to start getting lowered as we move forward.
Yeah, that is a major change in how we operate. And you mentioned something around having to have these rules-based engines. I look at like the whole world of business process automation and optimization. Those are very rules-based systems, and you had to account for every edge case, which is very difficult
Yeah.
to do. And now you don't necessarily need to do that. So I think that's a huge shift at play as well. But on the data side, I think if you think, all right, we're bringing AI into the industry, focus on the problem. I think there's some of the things we talked about in terms of the value and the risk and all those different things. But in this new age, data is going to be one of your best moat builders and differentiators potentially because ChatGPT may be trained on the entire corpus of the public internet,
Yeah.
but it's not, unless there's some sketchy stuff they're doing, it's not trained on your private data. And that's proprietary to you as a company or even an individual, if you think about it in some ways. But that's proprietary to you. And then you can unleash these generative AI models and approaches in conjunction with that proprietary data. So that's another big consideration when you're thinking through use cases is how can we leverage our proprietary data in just interesting and novel ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I want to really shine the light on is when it comes to the health and hygiene of the data, that is
Hmm.
table stakes.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what technique, what tool you're using, your data is still needs to be treated as the first class citizen, right?
Hmm.
The moment you drop the ball on the data is when you have no clue, you have no faith, no trust on what the outcomes are going to be, regardless of what tool you're bringing in. Especially when it comes to generative AI, and like you said, these models were trained on large corpus of data, the internet. Now, if I'm just saying, if I get the internet, I just want to train this or fine tune this on my data that I have confidence on. You still need to make sure that it doesn't have any privileged information, doesn't have any personal information, doesn't have any of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
You still need to do those scans and security checks and have those sort of controls and checks and balances. You still need to have humans in the loop to make sure that you can trust that data because you're about to unleash an LLM, which is just going to crawl everything, right?
Hmm.
And then on the flip side, think about all the right guardrails you need to put in place, right? To make sure that even if the model is picking up certain things that it wasn't supposed to, that you have a control right before the response is put out, which is checking through these things and catching them and flagging them, if not blocking them from getting to the
Yeah.
end user and getting into, especially in the hands of bad actors, which could do anything malicious with your data.
Yeah. And that's the guardrails piece is even more important when you have a system that can use logic and reasoning to
Yeah.
do whatever it may be. So that becomes a huge part of it. So I want to shift to the strategy side of it. In a book I love, Seven Powers by Hamilton Helward, talks through the different powers you can leverage for moat building differentiation. And I want to go through them and think of how are they applying in this age of generative AI? Do some become more important or less important? But if we're going through those, so just for reference, they are scale economies, network economies, which is like network effects, counter positioning, switching cost, branding, cornered resources, and process power. But if we start with scale economies, so this is like the cost advantage you have when you start to have scale. And I don't know about you, but the one thing that comes to mind is just the foundation models. Like they're starting to pull way ahead and they're starting to gain scale. And it almost has this effect at play where it's compounding in nature, right? So you have these foundation models taking place. But anything interesting on the scale economy component that comes to mind for you in this like generative AI age we're living in right now?
Yeah, I think this depends on where you're coming from and looking at this, right? So,
Hmm.
are you coming in as something like a chip manufacturer, right? Like an
Yeah.
NVIDIA or AMD or Intel? Or are you coming in as a consumer services or products company like an Apple,
Hmm.
Facebook, or something like that? Or you're coming in. This just depends. I think the scale economy or the economies of scale will really, I think, grease the wheels in terms of the cost, right?
Yeah.
We've seen the cost drop dramatically, right? Because there's more and more horsepower that's being generated. The chips are getting smarter and better and more efficient, right? So the unit cost of producing the same outcome is dropping dramatically, right? We're
Hmm.
starting to see the context window size, improve or increase dramatically, right? The Moore's law is just going out of the window. We're
Yeah.
seeing this thing double every 2 months. Forget 18 months.
Yeah.
And
There's almost this new law at play
yeah,
with AI.
yeah,
I've heard somebody referencing, I forget who it was, but they said this is like the fastest accelerating depreciating asset we've ever seen when you think of how fast it's accelerating from the capability and then the reduction in cost that's happening over time.
100%. And the thing is, you mentioned a few different concepts over there: scale economy. You mentioned network effect.
Yeah.
There was another thing you mentioned, but I think they all sort of play in tandem, right? It's not. There's a very interesting interplay between all of these concepts, and
Yeah.
it's, you, it's like you're trying to go for this flywheel effect, right?
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
crank the engine. At some point, you get to a point where the engine is just like feeding itself. And network effect, for example, I strongly believe that as companies, whether you're in the federal business organization, whether you're in federal business or you commercial or startup, as you build more meaningful use cases, more compelling use cases, people will just they will latch on to it because the biggest sort of the most expensive sort of asset that we all have that is that cannot be recovered is time. And if you can
Hmm.
help me save time, then that is a huge thing. And
Yeah.
so my favorite example is like travel. I'll go back to travel as my favorite example. I and my family we love to travel. We spend a bunch of time when we're trying to think of trips. We're about to head out towards North Carolina, drop my daughter off for a pre-college program, and then we're going to head out towards Asheville and Nashville. Those are two new towns I haven't been to.
Hmm.
And I've already spent like almost 8 hours, maybe 10 hours researching Airbnb and what are the stops on the way and where should I stay and where can I. And imagine if there was a solution today that can help solve that problem. And I think generative AI will solve that because all the
Yeah.
data is. But today, my traditional tools are Airbnb, Expedia, just Google search, right? There might be a few other things, right? But imagine if there was a travel agent, and I've been dropping a few LinkedIn notes on agents and how they're coming fast and furious. Imagine a generative AI agent, an LLM based agent that can ask me my need and then within a matter of seconds, if not minutes, come up with a very detailed itinerary and agenda and propose that to me. Better yet, it may not get it right the first time, but it could at least give me take a first pass and say, Uday, what do you think about this? And I'm like, hey, I like this and this, but this thing is not, can you change this? You know, and it goes back. And
Hmm.
so this iterative workflow and this literal conversation that if a system or an agent can mimic that, and that's how we humans think, that is game changing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to hit on some of those other ones, like the network effects, like that's going to be super interesting as you start to build these foundational models. Counter positioning, really interesting one in terms of thinking about traditional companies, and you have new companies coming in that could completely disrupt and use positioning against them. in that way. And just switching costs, I think, is another interesting one. I'd be
Yeah.
curious your take here. But if building solutions becomes markedly cheaper, easier, whatever you might think there, does the switching cost also come down? Does that kind of open the floodgates in some interesting areas? I think that could be
100%,
curious over time.
100%. Let's look at the big brands from the big brands today.
Mhm.
Let's look at Spotify. It's in the streaming music business, right?
Yeah.
And Spotify is the leader when it comes to that. What's to say that in a couple of years, a startup comes forward with a way to crawl music out there that's available, or even it subscribes to these original label owners and music record owners, and is able to come up with a interactive engine, a
Mhm.
system that can really be give you a very personalized experience. So today, Spotify is trying to do that, and I love Spotify, and use it all the time. Spotify is trying to go there, but it still has an organization like Spotify has. They've invested a lot in their tech infrastructure and the experiences. For them to disrupt that and go to a whole different experience is very disruptive, right? And
Yeah.
it's really high cost, high risk, and it's a lot at stake. As opposed to Matt, you and some of your developers from HatchWorks saying, "Hey, I think we can do this. Let's go do this on our own." That idea can be implemented in a matter of weeks, if not months, and you can
Mhm.
go down, get launched there. And as a consumer, I'm not married to Spotify.
Yeah.
If I get Matt's music tomorrow available on my app store, I'll go check it out. And if it's saying, "Hey, Uday, I can understand your music interest and feel, and taste better, and I can serve it things up better," I think that's going to be game changer. So yes, back to your switching costs. Those are remarkably low now. If it wasn't the cloud and AI, now LMs are just dropping the prices like crazy. And there's an arms race where I think we will see some game-changing disruptions and a lot of upsets of the incumbents happening in the near future.
Yeah, and I think take that example one step further. I mean, you have startups now that are creating AI generated music, and it's surprisingly good for you. You potentially have this business model where you've just cut out the actual artist. So what does that do to the whole change? So there's whole that's the interesting thing, I think, is there are entirely new business models potentially evolving out of this innovation. But to wrap us up, I want to
Yeah.
ask you one question. So you
Yep.
mentioned around the concept of agents, the huge topic right now, agentive, the nature of generative AI. And you also mentioned at the beginning this concept of solving for the user, the customer, keeping them in mind. Do you think there's going to be a point to where we are considering AI agents in that equation within a product mindset where we're solving for AI agents in a sense to where maybe they actually become users of the future that we as like product folks need to consider?
Yeah, I think there's a very strong relationship between problem solving, understanding customer needs, and this idea of agents, a concept of agents. Agents may sound like a fancy word to wrap this concept, but really it's about think of in your organization, any typical organization, think of a role that a person or colleague or an employee is playing. It could be they might be in a recruiting function, they might be in a content generation function, they might be in a financial analysis function. And each of these individuals does different jobs in a typical day, right? So they have, we again, in products or jargon, jobs to be done. If you apply
Yeah.
the jobs to be done sort of framework to Matt's job, Uday's job, right? You'll start bringing down like, hey, these are 8 or 10 typical things Matt or Uday does 80% of the time. Now, when you take that one job, then you can start bringing that down. You can deconstruct that into tasks. In order to do this job, in order for Matt to organize this podcast with Uday, he has to do these 5 tasks.
Mhm.
Each of these tasks has a set of tools that are associated with this, right? So there's a very close relationship between understanding and unpacking problems and a way to solution them with how agents manifest or would manifest themselves. Now, the one thing that's still imperative, going back to fundamental, is this job worthy of an agent, right? Now, there could be two things, two ways to look at amongst many. One is this job is too complex. Math job of organizing a podcast is too complex. There's too many moving parts. We cannot solve it given the tools that we have today, right? Or the other thing could be on the flip side, it's too easy. It's not really solving, right? And 5 minutes, it doesn't work. Why would you go invest that, right? I think we still have to think about that. But what agents are allowing us to do today and giving us a small glimpse into the future is that how these different job functions in a typical organization and typical employee can be unpacked, and how we can bring reasoning and validation and review and research into a LLM-based setup environment, which is not there today. Today, we talk about zero-shot prompting and multi-shot prompting, but over here, we're changing the ballgame. We are bringing the typical interactions that humans have within amongst each other or with systems. We're taking that sort of pattern and orchestrating that using LLMs and tools.
Yeah, no, great spot to stop there, Uday, in terms of jobs to be done, great framework and the topic of agents. But I appreciate you being on. And where can people find you? What's the easiest way to get in contact with Uday if they want to chat or learn
Yeah,
more about what you do and your thoughts?
yeah, you can always look me up on LinkedIn. That's where I spend most of my time. And again, Matt, you did give me a wonderful introduction early on, but I consider myself a product guy, especially a tech product guy who has done a thing or two or knows a thing or two about data products, decision products, and now AI products. Happy to chat about anything that you might want to explore with regards to everything from problem solving to solutioning. And I grew up as an engineer, so I have a lot of empathy and admiration for engineers. So happy to talk to CTOs and CIOs as well. But again, Matt, thank you for this opportunity to share my ideas with HatchWorks, and look forward to continuing this conversation with your audience and folks outside.
Nice. Appreciate it, Uday. Thanks for listening to the Talking AI podcast. If you enjoyed the show, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to leave us a review. We love those. For more info on Talking AI, visit talkingaipodcast.com.